Sometimes God places us in situations where our faith will be tested. Have you ever been tempted to compromise the standards of your faith to be accepted by others? At the end of the lesson, we will analyze the choice Daniel and his friends faced, and that choice's outcome. Aspire to have the faith of Daniel when confronted with contradictory directives from authorities, and identify similar situations that call for the exercise of faith. Following the defeat of Judah, Daniel and his friends, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah, were among the young men taken into exile in Babylon. Going into captivity meant that the people of Judah would be subjected to the traditions and practices of Babylon, a pagan nation. Daniel was subject to Babylonian law, but he loved God and decided firmly to remain loyal to worshiping Him. And that brings us to our key verse for today, which reads, "But Daniel was determined not to defile himself by eating the food and wine given to them by the king. He asked the chief of staff for permission not to eat these unacceptable foods." Daniel chapter 1, verse 8. Daniel refused to let anything defile his heart. One way to remain ceremonially pure was to refuse to eat the king's meat. This meat was probably first offered to idols, and Daniel and his friends were determined to avoid the sin of idolatry, which was the very reason that Judah was now in captivity. Daniel also refused to drink the king's wine. The word for favor, chesed, means goodness or kindness. It is often translated loving kindness in the Old Testament to describe God's gracious acts to preserve and redeem his people. God gave Daniel such favor with the prince of the eunuchs. Although we typically think about this story as concerning Daniel's courage to stand up for his convictions, this passage actually points out God's faithfulness. Daniel and his friends were experiencing the consequences of Judah's disobedience. By causing the eunuch to be sympathetic toward Daniel, God was acting in faithfulness to his promise and honoring the prayers of the righteous from ages past. The chief eunuch believed that changing the diet of those under his care would be directly disobeying the king's orders. Daniel likely asked for the 10-day test as a way to acknowledge the eunuch's concerns. By our thinking, 10 days on an alternative diet would neither be long enough for their appearance to suffer nor show significant improvement. But Daniel's faith was in God, and in 10 days he knew that God would make the difference and give them favor. If the Lord wanted him to stand for righteousness by abstaining from the king's food, God would direct the heart of the man who had the power to make it possible for him. Daniel could only have faith to believe that God would reveal himself in the midst of the test, proving to all that he was God Almighty. At the end of the test, Daniel and his friends looked better than the children who had eaten from the king's table. The king likely interrogated the young men, either individually or in groups, to discern the depth of their understanding. Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah stood head and shoulders above the rest of the captives. While these 4 young men distinguished themselves before Nebuchadnezzar, they also distinguished themselves before God through their courage and faithfulness to God's commands. Many other Jewish youths were enrolled in the same program of education and leadership development, but only these 4, certainly a minority, are recorded to have maintained steadfast loyalty to their God. Daniel and his 3 friends were wiser than all their peers and outdid even the king's diviners. And we later learn that Daniel was actually appointed chief of the magicians and wise men because Nebuchadnezzar realized that Daniel was filled with the Spirit of God, and that he was actually correct in his interpretations and predictions, unlike the king's magicians. And so here's our lesson. Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah, or Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, were rising stars in the Babylon after their interview with the king. At the time of their exile, no one would have predicted their ascent to the upper echelons of Babylonian government in the next 3 years. After all, they were basically prisoners of war, but God called them to act courageously, and God honored their faithfulness by using them to leave a powerful and lasting testimony of the one true living God. By sticking to their convictions, they experienced the power of God in incredible ways.